July 23, 1995, Medicine Bow National Forest, Wyoming. A silence hung over the vast wilderness. The kind of silence that doesn't belong in a place where two young people should be laughing around a campfire. Sarah Mitchell, a dependable 24-year-old teacher's aide, and Jake Thompson, her boyfriend of 3 years and a 26-year-old ranch hand, hadn't returned from their camping trip at South Spring Creek Reservoir. Sarah's mother, Patricia Mitchell, felt a knot tightening in her stomach as Sunday evening turned to Monday morning, with no word from her daughter. Sarah always called when she said she would. Always. Patricia drove the 50 miles from Rawlins to the reservoir, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Jake's father, Tom Thompson, followed in his pickup truck, his jaw set with worry. When they arrived at the remote camping site around noon on Monday, the first thing they saw sparked a flicker of hope. Sarah and Jake's 1989 Ford Bronco was still parked at the campsite, tent still standing, cooler, sitting by the fire ring. Maybe they'd just hiked farther than planned. Maybe they'd lost track of time. But hope died when they got closer. The tent had been slashed open. Camping gear was scattered everywhere. Sarah's backpack lay in the dirt, its contents spilled across the ground. Jake's fishing rod was snapped in half. And there was blood. Not much, but enough. Dark stains on the dirt near the tent entrance. Patricia Mitchell's scream echoed across the empty reservoir. When Carbon County Sheriff's deputies and FBI agents arrived at the scene 2 hours later, they found evidence of a violent struggle. But Sarah Mitchell and Jake Thompson were nowhere to be found. What investigators didn't know yet was that the young couple was alive. Barely. Miles away, locked in the trunk of their own vehicle, left to die in the Wyoming wilderness, fighting for every breath in the suffocating darkness. And the man who'd done this to them had vanished into the vast, unforgiving landscape of the American West, believing his secret was buried forever. For 26 years, the brutal attack on Sarah Mitchell and Jake Thompson haunted Carbon County, Wyoming. 2 young lives shattered by unimaginable violence. A community living in fear. A predator who walked free while his victims fought to rebuild what he destroyed. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and the algorithm gods will make sure you don't miss any future uploads. The attack on Sarah Mitchell and Jake Thompson was not just a local tragedy. It was the first domino that exposed the vulnerability of even the most remote American communities and revealed how a predator could nearly get away with perfect crimes in the vast emptiness of the American West. In 2021, 26 years after the attack, a cold case unit identified a suspect. It wasn't a drifter passing through. It wasn't a random stranger. It was someone who had traveled to Carbon County multiple times over the years. Someone who knew the remote camping areas. Someone who had been living a normal life in Missouri, while Sarah and Jake spent decades dealing with the psychological scars of what he'd done to them. The vulnerability of isolated wilderness areas where help is miles away, the power of victims who refuse to be silenced despite unimaginable trauma. How DNA technology can solve cases even when traditional investigation fails, the devastating reality of suspects who die before facing justice, the lasting impact of violence on survivors who must live with it every day, how small-town law enforcement never gave up despite decades passing. The Carbon County community was forever changed. Fear swept through Rawlins and the surrounding ranch country like a prairie wildfire. Families who had camped in the Medicine Bow National Forest for generations stopped going. Parents forbade their teenagers from hiking alone. The beautiful wilderness that had been a source of pride and recreation became a place of terror. Local outfitters reported a 60% drop in camping reservations in the summer of 1996. The South Spring Creek Reservoir, once a popular spot for young couples and families, sat largely abandoned for years. When people did camp there, they went in groups, armed, and never after dark. The hidden evil that had invaded Sarah and Jake's campsite could be anywhere, waiting in any remote canyon, hiding behind any stand of pine trees. The most disturbing fact, the attacker had been methodical. He'd brought a rifle. He'd known exactly where to find isolated victims. He'd planned to kill them and leave no witnesses. The only reason Sarah Mitchell and Jake Thompson survived was their own determination to live and a stroke of incredible luck. The trunk lock on their 1989 Ford Bronco had a safety release mechanism that glowed in the dark. Without that faint green glow in the suffocating darkness, they would have died. Their bodies might never have been found in the vast Wyoming wilderness. The case would have remained a missing persons mystery forever. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. I'm always fascinated to see how far these stories travel and how they connect us across distances. Today we'll walk through the events of July 1995. We'll trace 26 years of living with trauma, fighting for justice, and refusing to let the case die. We'll reveal how cutting-edge DNA technology finally identified the man who destroyed 2 young lives, and why justice remained frustratingly out of reach. This is a story of survival against impossible odds, persistence in the face of defeat, and ultimately, the bittersweet reality that sometimes the guilty escape earthly justice. Rawlins, Wyoming in 1995 felt like a place the modern world had forgotten, and that was exactly how the 9,000 residents liked it. Nestled in Carbon County at 6,755 feet elevation, surrounded by the endless sagebrush plains and the Medicine Bow Mountains to the south, Rawlins was a town where cowboys still outnumbered suits, where handshake deals meant more than contracts, and where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. This was a place where the biggest entertainment on Friday nights was the high school football game, where kids grew up riding horses before they could drive cars, where you could see the Milky Way from your backyard because there wasn't a street light for miles. With Wyoming's population hovering around 480,000 people spread across the 10th largest state in America, isolation was a way of life. Carbon County had fewer than 17,000 residents scattered across an area larger than Connecticut. Your nearest neighbor might be 10 miles away. The nearest Walmart was in Laramie, 100 miles east. This was the world Sarah Mitchell and Jake Thompson had always known, a young couple whose love for the Wyoming wilderness would nearly cost them everything. Sarah Lynn Mitchell was born on March 15, 1971, in Rawlins, Wyoming, the youngest of 3 children. Her father, Dale Mitchell, managed a ranch outside of town. Her mother, Patricia, worked as a nurse at Carbon County Memorial Hospital. From a young age, Sarah showed a fierce love for the outdoors and a gentle spirit that drew people to her. She was the kid who rescued injured birds and nursed them back to health in a shoebox in her bedroom. The teenager who volunteered at the local library, teaching younger kids to read. The young woman who everyone said had a calling to work with children. Sarah had this way of making even the shyest kid feel special. Her mother, Patricia, would later recall, tears streaming down her face. She saw the good in everyone. She trusted people. That beautiful innocence, that's what he took from her. Sarah graduated from Carbon County High School in 1989, a straight-A student with a scholarship to the University of Wyoming in Laramie. But after one semester, she'd fell homesick and overwhelmed by the big city of 30,000 people. She came back to Rawlins and took a job as a teacher's aide at the local elementary school, planning to save money and maybe try college again someday. She loved her job. The kids adored her. She was making $18,000 a year and living in a small apartment on Cedar Street, but she was happy. She had her family, her friends, and the Wyoming she loved. Jake Lee Thompson was born on November 3, 1968, in Saratoga, Wyoming, about 35 miles southwest of Rawlins. He was the second son of Tom Thompson, a fourth-generation rancher who ran cattle on 3,000 acres of high plains grassland. Jake grew up in a saddle. By the time he was 12, he could rope a calf, break a horse, and fix a truck engine. He was quiet, hardworking, the kind of young man who showed up early and stayed late. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. After high school, Jake worked on his father's ranch, earning $1,200 a month plus room and board. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, and Jake loved being outdoors. He loved the solitude of riding fence lines, the challenge of calving season, the satisfaction of a hard day's work done right. His brother, Mark, had left Wyoming for Denver, chasing money and city life. But Jake never wanted to leave. This was his land, his home, his life. Jake was Wyoming through and through, his father Tom would later say. He belonged to this land. What happened to him out there in those woods, it nearly broke him. Nearly broke all of us. Sarah and Jake met in the spring of 1992 at the County Fair Rodeo, one of Rawlins' biggest annual events. Sarah had come with friends to watch the bull riding. Jake was competing in the team roping event. Their eyes met across the arena, a cliché that was absolutely true. Jake, covered in arena dust, tipped his hat to her. Sarah, normally shy, waved back. After his event, where he and his partner took second place, Jake worked up the courage to approach her at the concession stand. "You like rodeos?" he asked, not knowing what else to say. "I like watching people who are brave enough to get on angry animals," Sarah replied with a smile. Jake laughed. "That's not bravery. That's stupidity with a belt buckle." They talked for 2 hours, sitting in the bleachers, as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that only Wyoming can produce. Jake went home that night and told his father he'd met someone special. Tom Thompson just smiled. He recognized that look in his son's eyes. Sarah and Jake's relationship developed slowly, the Wyoming way. Long drives on dirt roads, talking for hours. Picnics by the North Platte River. Quiet dinners at Jake's family ranch, where Sarah charmed Tom Thompson by not being afraid to help with the dishes or ask questions about ranching. They discovered they wanted the same things: a simple life, close to family, maybe kids someday, definitely horses, and a small piece of land they could call their own. By the summer of 1993, they were inseparable. Sarah had a photo of Jake on her desk at school. Jake carried a picture of Sarah in his wallet, creased from being opened, and looked at 100 times. They talked about getting married maybe in 1996 or 1997, once they'd saved enough for a down payment on some land. Jake wanted to start his own small ranch. Sarah dreamed of continuing to work with kids, maybe becoming a certified teacher someday. That summer of 1995, they were 24 and 26 years old, young and in love, standing at the threshold of the life they'd planned. One of their favorite things to do together was camp in the Medicine Bow National Forest. They'd drive Jake's pickup truck about 40 miles south of Rawlins, following dirt roads into the wilderness, until they reached South Spring Creek Reservoir. It was a beautiful, isolated spot at 8,000 feet elevation, a small mountain lake surrounded by stands of lodgepole pines and aspen trees, with the Medicine Bow Peak visible in the distance. In July, wildflowers carpeted the meadows. The fishing was good. The nights were cool and clear, perfect for stargazing. They'd been camping there together since the summer of 1993, always in July, when Jake could take a few days off from a ranch. It was their special place, their escape from the world. They always set up camp in the same spot, a flat area about 200 yards from the water, sheltered by trees, with a fire ring made from river stones that they'd built themselves. In July 1995, they planned their annual trip with excitement. They'd bought a new tent, a 4-person Coleman, that had been on sale at the hardware store in town. Sarah had made a list of everything they'd need: sleeping bags, cooler, fishing gear, firewood, marshmallows for s'mores. On Friday, July 21, 1995, they loaded up Jake's 1989 Ford Bronco and headed south on Highway 130, winding their way into the mountains as the sun began to set. "This is going to be the best trip yet," Sarah said, squeezing Jake's hand as they drove. Jake smiled, his eyes on the road ahead. "It always is when I'm with you." They had no idea they were driving toward a nightmare. No idea that a predator was watching the remote camping areas, looking for victims. No idea that their idyllic weekend would turn into the most terrifying ordeal of their lives. Their Ford Bronco disappeared into the Medicine Bow National Forest, taillights fading into the gathering dusk of the Wyoming wilderness. Friday evening, July 21, 1995, was perfect. The temperature dropped to a comfortable 65 degrees as the sun set behind the mountains. Sarah and Jake set up their new tent, laughing as they struggled to figure out the instructions. They built a fire in their stone ring, cooked hot dogs and beans for dinner, and talked about their future as stars began to appear overhead, thousands of them, bright and clear in the unpolluted sky. "I want to bring our kids here someday," Sarah said softly, leaning against Jake as they sat by the fire. "Our kids." Jake smiled. "You proposing to me, Mitchell?" Sarah blushed. "Maybe I am, Thompson." They stayed up until midnight, feeding the fire, talking about everything and nothing, completely alone in the vast wilderness. The nearest other campers were at least 5 miles away. The nearest town was 40 miles of winding mountain roads. It was exactly the solitude they'd wanted. Saturday, July 22nd, was equally perfect. They hiked around the reservoir, fished for trout. Jake caught 3, Sarah caught 1, and spent the afternoon reading paperback novels in the shade of the aspens. That evening, they drove into Saratoga, about 25 miles away, for dinner at a local restaurant and to stock up on more ice and beer. They were back at their campsite by 9 p.m., just as twilight settled over the mountains. They built another fire, roasted marshmallows, and listened to a portable radio playing country music from a station in Laramie that faded in and out with static. Around 11 p.m., exhausted from 2 days of hiking and fresh air, they crawled into their tent and fell asleep in each other's arms, the fire burning low outside. Neither of them heard the footsteps approaching their campsite. Neither of them saw the shadow moving through the trees, carrying a rifle. Neither of them knew that their worst nightmare was about to begin. Sunday, July 23, 1995, 2:47 a.m. Sarah woke to the sound of the tent zipper being yanked open. Before she could scream, before she could even process what was happening, a figure lunged into the tent. The beam of a powerful flashlight blinded her. "Don't move. Don't scream, or I'll blow his fucking head off." The voice was calm, matter of fact, which somehow made it more terrifying. Jake was already awake, his body tense beside her. In the harsh beam of the flashlight, Sarah could see what had woken her. A man, probably in his 30s or early 40s, wearing a dark jacket and a black baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. And in his hands, pointed directly at Jake's chest, was a hunting rifle. "Out of the tent. Both of you. Now." Sarah's mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. A robbery? A crazy person? A hunter who'd stumbled on their camp drunk? But the methodical way the man moved, the way he positioned himself to cover both of them with the rifle, the way he brought duct tape and rope, this was no accident. This was planned. "Please," Jake said, his voice steady despite the terror Sarah could see in his eyes. "Just take whatever you want. The truck keys are in my jeans. We've got maybe $200 cash in the cooler." The man laughed, a cold sound that echoed in the darkness. "I don't want your money, cowboy." He made them stand facing the truck, hands on the hood, while he used duct tape to bind their wrists behind their backs. The tape was so tight Sarah could feel it cutting into her skin. Then he forced them to walk away from the campsite, deeper into the woods, the rifle barrel pressed against Jake's spine. "If you run, I shoot the girl first," the man said. "Then I shoot you. And nobody's going to find your bodies out here for months, maybe years." Sarah was crying now, silently, tears streaming down her face. She kept glancing at Jake, trying to communicate with her eyes. "What do we do? What do we do?" Jake's jaw was clenched, his muscles tense, and Sarah knew he was looking for an opportunity to fight back. But the man was careful, always staying just out of reach, the rifle always pointed at one of them. What followed was 4 hours of unspeakable horror. The man led them to a small clearing about a quarter mile from their campsite. He'd been there before. There were signs he'd prepared this spot, cleared away brush, created a place where screams wouldn't carry. He made Jake lie face down on the ground, the rifle barrel pressed against the back of his head, while he assaulted Sarah. She tried to dissociate, to let her mind float away somewhere else, but the pain kept pulling her back. Jake was forced to listen, unable to move, unable to help, tears of rage and helplessness streaming down his face into the pine needles. "I'm going to kill you both anyway," the man said conversationally at one point, as if discussing the weather. "But if you cooperate, I'll make it quick. If you fight, I'll make you suffer." When he was finished with Sarah, he turned his attention to Jake, beating him with the rifle, but for no reason other than sadistic pleasure. Jake's nose broke with a sickening crack. Blood poured from a gash above his eye. The entire time, the man talked. He told them about other people he'd hurt, other places he'd been. He seemed to enjoy their fear, feeding off it like a vampire feeding on blood. Sarah later couldn't remember all of what he said. Trauma has a way of erasing details too horrible to hold, but she remembered the cold, detached tone of his voice. He felt nothing for them. They were objects, entertainment, less than human in his eyes. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, around 6:30 a.m., the man made a decision. "Can't shoot you," he muttered, almost to himself. "Gunshots carry too far. Someone might hear." He forced them to walk back to their campsite, both of them barely able to stand. Sarah's legs were shaking so badly she kept stumbling. Jake's face was a mask of blood. When they reached the Bronco, the man popped the back hatch and looked at the rear cargo area. "Get in." "What?" Jake's voice was hoarse. "The back. Both of you. Now." The cargo area of the Bronco was small, maybe 4 feet by 3 feet. There was no way 2 adults could fit comfortably. "We won't fit," Sarah whispered. The man raised the rifle. "Figure it out." They climbed in, Sarah first, then Jake, their bound bodies pressed together in the cramped space. The man slammed the hatch closed, plunging them into complete darkness. They heard him moving around outside, doing something to the vehicle. Then footsteps walking away. For several minutes, they lay in the darkness, listening, waiting for the gunshot that would end their lives. It never came. Instead, they heard an engine start, not their Bronco, but another vehicle somewhere nearby. The sound faded into the distance. And then there was only silence. "He's gone," Jake whispered. "Sarah, he's gone." "Why didn't he kill us?" Sarah's voice was barely audible. "Maybe he thought we'd suffocate back here. Or maybe he just wanted us to die slowly." The temperature in the cargo area was already rising as the morning sun beat down on the dark metal of the Bronco. The air was stale, thick, hard to breathe. "We have to get out," Jake said, trying to move his bound hands. "We have to find a way out." But the hatch was locked from the outside. There was no interior release. They were trapped. For hours, they lay in that suffocating darkness, taking shallow breaths to conserve oxygen, their bodies pressed together in the cramped space. The temperature climbed past 90 degrees, then 100, then higher. They were both dehydrated, injured, exhausted. Sarah kept drifting in and out of consciousness. At one point, she thought she was dying and made peace with it. The darkness felt almost welcoming. "Stay with me," Jake kept whispering. "Stay awake, Sarah. Please." It was Jake who saw it first, around 2 p.m., nearly 8 hours after they'd been locked in the cargo area. A faint green glow in the darkness. At first, he thought he was hallucinating from heat and dehydration. But no, there it was, a small glowing spot near the back hatch. "Sarah," he whispered urgently. "Sarah, wake up. Look." Sarah's eyes fluttered open. "What?" "There. Do you see it? That green glow." She focused her eyes. Yes, a small glowing circle, maybe the size of a quarter, low on the interior of the hatch. "What is it?" she asked. Jake's mind was racing. He'd grown up working on vehicles. He knew cars inside and out. And suddenly he remembered. It's the emergency release. This Bronco has a glow-in-the-dark emergency trunk release. Hope surged through them both, sharp and painful. "Can you reach it?" Sarah asked. Jake twisted his body, ignoring the screaming pain in his ribs and face, and managed to get his bound hands near the glowing mechanism. His fingers, numb from the tight duct tape, fumbled at it. "Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Come on." With a click that sounded like a gunshot in the confined space, the hatch release disengaged. The hatch popped up slightly, and blessed fresh air flooded in. They'd found their way out. Using his shoulder, Jake pushed the hatch fully open. They tumbled out of the Bronco and onto the ground, gasping, barely able to move. The sun was brutal, blinding after hours in darkness. Sarah vomited from dehydration and heat exhaustion. Jake tried to stand and fell, his legs refusing to support him. "We have to go," Jake said, looking around frantically. He might come back. Go where? Sarah asked. We're 40 miles from anywhere. There's a Forest Service station on Highway 130. Maybe 10 miles from here. If we can get to the highway, maybe someone will stop. 10 miles. Sarah looked down at herself. She was barefoot, wearing only torn pajama bottoms and Jake's blood-stained t-shirt. Jake was in boxers and boots, his face a mask of dried blood. They were both severely injured, dehydrated, traumatized. We don't have a choice, Jake said quietly. If we stay here, we die. What followed was one of the most grueling ordeals either of them would ever endure. They couldn't untie each other's hands. The duct tape was too strong, too tight. So they started walking with their wrists still bound behind them, helping each other navigate the rough terrain. The first mile took almost 2 hours. They had to stop frequently for Sarah to rest. Her feet, bare on the rocky ground, were soon cut and bleeding. Jake tried to walk ahead of her, testing the ground to find the easiest path, but with his hands bound, he kept losing his balance. Around 5 p.m., they reached a Forest Service dirt road. It was rutted and overgrown, clearly not used often, but it was easier than bushwhacking through the forest. They followed it east, toward where they thought the highway might be. By 7 p.m., as the sun began to set, they'd covered maybe 6 miles. They were both moving on autopilot now, their bodies running on nothing but adrenaline and the will to survive. Sarah's feet left bloody footprints in the dust. Jake's face had swollen so badly he could barely see out of his left eye. They hadn't had water in over 24 hours. We're not going to make it, Sarah said at one point, her voice flat with exhaustion and defeat. Yes, we are, Jake replied. Just a little farther. Just keep moving. At 9:43 p.m., nearly 20 hours after the attack began, they stumbled onto Highway 130. They stood on the shoulder of the dark road, too broken, bloodied figures barely able to stand, and waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. 15. No one's coming, Sarah whispered. Then, like a miracle, headlights appeared in the distance. Jake stumbled into the middle of the road, waving his bound arms, not caring if the vehicle hit him. They had to get help. They had to. The vehicle, a pickup truck driven by a rancher named Bob Hollis, who lived in encampment, slammed on its brakes, swerving to avoid Jake. Bob jumped out, took one look at the scene, and grabbed his radio. This is Bob Hollis on Highway 130, mile marker 47. I need emergency services immediately. I've got 2 people here, looks like they've been attacked. They're in bad shape. Send everything. Within 40 minutes, the highway was swarming with emergency vehicles. Carbon County Sheriff's deputies, Wyoming Highway Patrol, an ambulance from Rawlins, and FBI agents from Cheyenne all converged on the scene. Sarah and Jake were rushed to Carbon County Memorial Hospital in Rawlins, where doctors worked frantically to stabilize them. Both were severely dehydrated. Sarah had injuries consistent with sexual assault. Jake had a broken nose, 2 cracked ribs, and a skull fracture that required immediate CT scans to rule out brain bleeding. But they were alive. While Sarah and Jake were being treated, a massive search and rescue operation was launched to find their campsite and any evidence of the attacker. Using Jake's description of the route they'd taken, follow the dirt road from Highway 130, about 40 miles south. The campsite is near a reservoir with the mountains behind it. Deputies and U.S. Forest Service rangers began searching the Medicine Bow National Forest. At 3:22 a.m. on Monday, July 24th, they found the campsite at South Spring Creek Reservoir. Deputy Martin Cole, a 15-year veteran of the Carbon County Sheriff's Office, was the first to approach the scene. What he saw made his blood run cold. The tent had been slashed open. Camping gear was scattered everywhere. There was blood on the ground near the tent entrance. Not much, but enough. The Ford Bronco sat in the clearing, its rear hatch standing open, the cargo area clearly visible. We've got the scene, Cole radioed back. Looks consistent with the victim's statements. We need evidence technicians out here ASAP. By sunrise on Monday, a team of FBI evidence technicians had arrived from Cheyenne. They photographed everything, collected blood samples, bagged potential evidence, and processed the entire campsite. What they found was both encouraging and frustrating. Evidence collected. DNA evidence from the sexual assault of Sarah Mitchell, collected at the hospital. Blood samples from a campsite, later determined to be from Jake Thompson's injuries. Boot prints near the tent, size 11. Work boot-style duct tape residue from the victim's wrist. Several cigarette butts near a tree about 100 yards from the campsite, suggesting the attacker had watched them before approaching. What they didn't find: shell casings. The attacker had used a rifle only as a threat, never fired it. The weapon itself, any personal items belonging to the attacker. Clear fingerprints. Witnesses. The nearest campers were 5+ miles away and had heard nothing. The cigarette butts offered the best hope. In 1995, DNA technology was still in its relative infancy, but it existed. The FBI laboratory could extract DNA from saliva on the cigarette butts and compare it to the DNA collected from Sarah's assault examination. By Friday, July 28th, the results came back. The DNA matched. The same man who'd smoked those cigarettes watching their campsite was the man who'd attacked them. But there was a problem. Without a suspect, the DNA profile was just data. CODIS, the combined DNA index system that would eventually revolutionize law enforcement, was still in its pilot phase in 1995, not yet fully operational nationwide. They had the attacker's genetic fingerprint, but they had no way to find him. On Wednesday, July 26th, Sarah Mitchell was finally stable enough to give a full statement. She sat in a hospital room with FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres and Carbon County Sheriff's Detective Martin Cole, her mother holding her hand. She described the attack in halting, quiet words. She described the man's voice, his approximate height and build, what little she'd seen of his face in the darkness. He was white, maybe 35 to 45 years old, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Average height, maybe 5 feet 10 inches or 5 feet 11 inches. Stocky build, strong. He had a beard or heavy stubble, dark hair under his baseball cap. Did he have an accent? Agent Torres asked gently. No. He sounded normal. Midwestern maybe. He used some phrases that sounded Southern, like y'all a couple times. But mostly he just sounded American. Did he say anything about where he was from? Sarah shook her head. He talked about other places he'd been. He said something about Missouri, I think, and Texas. Or maybe Tennessee. It's all fuzzy. Jake's statement, given the next day, was similar. He'd been face down in the dirt for most of the attack, unable to see much. But he'd heard everything. He knew what he was doing, Jake said, his voice hard with barely controlled rage. He'd done this before. The way he talked about it, this wasn't his first time. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed a profile of the attacker based on the evidence and the victim's statements. Subject profile. White male, 35 to 50 years old, familiar with remote camping areas and wilderness survival, possibly works a job that involves travel, trucker, construction, oil field work. Has likely committed similar crimes in other states, sexually motivated, but also derives pleasure from control and inflicting fear, comfortable with firearms, methodical and organized. Plans his attacks may have military or law enforcement background based on tactical approach. The profile was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the western United States, along with the details of the attack and the physical description. And then nothing. No tips came in. No similar attacks were reported in other states. No suspects emerged. The investigation, despite the best efforts of dozens of investigators, was going cold. In the first weeks of the investigation, Carbon County Sheriff's investigators focused intensely on local suspects. The attacker had known where to find isolated victims. He'd been familiar with the terrain. This suggested someone who lived in or regularly visited the area. Deputies compiled a list of every registered sex offender in Carbon County and surrounding counties. There were 17 names on the list. One name stood out, Gerald Jerry Hastings, a 42-year-old unemployed oil field worker who lived in a trailer on the outskirts of Rawlins. Hastings had a conviction for attempted sexual assault from 1989. He'd served 3 years in Wyoming State Penitentiary and been released in 1992 with 10 years of probation. When investigators interviewed him on July 27th, he was evasive and hostile. Where were you the weekend of July 21st to 23rd? Detective Cole asked. Home. Watching TV. Anyone who can verify that? I live alone. Do you go camping in the Medicine Bow Forest? Sometimes. It's public land. I'm allowed. You familiar with South Spring Creek Reservoir? Hastings' eyes narrowed. What's this about? Investigators obtained a warrant for Hastings' DNA. The sample was collected on July 30th and sent to the FBI laboratory in Virginia for comparison to the unknown suspect profile. On August 15th, the results came back. No match. Gerald Hastings, despite his criminal history and suspicious behavior, was not their attacker. He was excluded completely. The first promising lead had evaporated. In September 1995, investigators received a tip from a waitress at a truck stop in Rawlins. She'd overheard a trucker talking about those kids who got attacked up in the mountains. He was laughing about it, the waitress said. Like it was funny. It gave me the creeps. The trucker was identified as Dennis Ray Kowalski, 38, from Omaha, Nebraska. He drove routes across Wyoming and Colorado regularly. FBI agents tracked him down at a truck stop in Colorado Springs on September 20th. When confronted, Kowalski was defensive. Yeah, I heard about it. Everyone's talking about it. I never said it was funny. That waitress must have misheard me. Where were you the weekend of July 21st to 23rd? Working. I've got logs to prove it. His logs showed he'd been in Cheyenne on July 21st, then drove to Salt Lake City on July 22nd to 23rd. But the logs could be falsified, investigators knew. Truckers sometimes ran two sets of books. They obtained Kowalski's DNA through a discarded coffee cup and sent it for comparison. Result, no match. Another dead end. In November 1995, a disturbing report came in from Montana. Two hikers, a man and woman in their 20s, had been attacked near Yellowstone National Park by a man with a rifle. The male victim had been beaten. The female victim had been sexually assaulted. The attacker had fled when a park ranger happened to drive by. The similarities to the Medicine Bow attack were striking. Same victim profile. Same weapon. Similar MO. Could this be the same attacker? FBI agents traveled to Montana to interview the victims and examine the evidence. But when they showed the Montana victims' photos and asked about details, the stories didn't quite match. The Montana attacker was younger, mid-20s, the victim said. Thinner build, different voice, different tattoos, and the DNA didn't match. It was a similar crime committed by a different predator. The realization was chilling. There was more than one person out there doing this. By December 1995, 6 months after the attack, the investigation had essentially stalled. Every lead had been exhausted. Every suspect had been cleared. The DNA profile sat in the FBI database, waiting for a match that never came. Sheriff Jim McCoy held a press conference on December 15, 1995, to announce that while the case remained open and active, they had no new leads to pursue. We will never give up on finding the person who did this to Sarah and Jake, McCoy said, his voice heavy with frustration. But we need the public's help. Someone knows who did this. Someone saw something. We're asking anyone with information to come forward. The tip line number was displayed on the local news. A $5,000 reward was offered by the Carbon County Commission, but no meaningful tips came in. The case, despite the best efforts of dedicated investigators, was going cold. For Sarah Mitchell and Jake Thompson, the months after the attack were a living hell. Sarah moved back in with her parents, unable to bear being alone. She couldn't sleep without nightmares. She couldn't drive past the Medicine Bow Mountains without having panic attacks. She took a leave of absence from her teaching job and spent months in therapy. Jake threw himself into work on the ranch, trying to exhaust himself so he wouldn't have to think. But the rage never left him. He was angry all the time at the attacker, at the investigators who couldn't find him, at God, at himself for not being able to protect Sarah. Their relationship, already strained by trauma, began to fracture under the weight of it all. We tried to make it work, Sarah would later say. We loved each other so much. But every time we looked at each other, we saw that night. We couldn't separate our love from the trauma. In March 1996, they mutually decided to take a break. By June, they'd broken up permanently. It was amicable, heartbreaking, necessary. Jake moved to Colorado for a year, trying to escape the memories. Sarah stayed in Rawlins, determined not to let the attacker drive her away from her home. Both of them carried the scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. The years passed with agonizing slowness for those invested in the case. 1996 turned to 1997. 1997 turned to 2000. The new millennium arrived. The Medicine Bow attack became a cautionary tale told around campfires. Be careful out there. Remember what happened to those kids in '95. The case file grew dusty in the Carbon County Sheriff's Office evidence room. The DNA profile remained in databases, waiting and used. Sheriff McCoy retired in 2004. His successor, Sheriff Tom Hendricks, inherited the unsolved case along with dozens of others. Sarah Mitchell married a kind man named David Chun in 2003. They had 2 children. She became a special education teacher, channeling her pain into helping vulnerable kids. She never went camping again. Jake Thompson eventually returned to Wyoming and took over his father's ranch. He never married. He kept a loaded shotgun by his bed every night, unable to shake the hypervigilance that came from surviving. Both of them had accepted in their own ways that they'd probably never know who'd attack them, that justice would never come. They were wrong. In 2018, the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation formally established a cold case team. The team consisted of 3 investigators: Special Agent David Kruger, Special Agent Linda Martinez, and forensic analyst Dr. Helen Chong. Their mission was simple but daunting. Review every unsolved homicide and major assault case in Wyoming from the past 50 years and determine which ones could benefit from modern forensic technology. One of the first cases they pulled was the 1995 Medicine Bow attack. "This one has always bothered me," said Agent Kruger at their first review meeting in January 2018. "We have DNA. We have victims who survived and gave statements. We have evidence. But the investigation just stopped. The technology at the time wasn't good enough." "What's different now?" asked Sheriff Archie Roybal of Carbon County, who'd been invited to the meeting. Dr. Chong leaned forward. "Everything. In 1995, we could extract DNA and create a profile, but that was about it. Now, we can do genealogical DNA analysis. We can take that profile and search through commercial genealogy databases, Ancestry, 23, andMe, aide match, and find relatives of the person. Then we build a family tree backwards until we identify potential suspects." The same technology that caught the Golden State Killer in 2018, Agent Martinez added. "It's revolutionizing cold case work." Sheriff Roybal nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "Access to the original evidence, particularly the cigarette butts and the DNA samples from 1995. Done. In March 2018, the preserved evidence from the Medicine Bow attack was transported from the Carbon County Evidence Storage Facility to the Wyoming Combined Laboratory in Cheyenne. Dr. Chong personally supervised the retesting. The DNA profile from 1995 was solid. The evidence had been well preserved, but now they could extract much more detailed genetic information. By May 2018, Dr. Chong had created a comprehensive genetic profile suitable for genealogical analysis. She uploaded it to aide match, a public database that allows law enforcement to search for familial matches. Within hours, the system found 7 potential genetic relatives of the unknown suspect. They were all distant cousins, 3rd, 4th, and 5th cousins, but it was a start. Over the next 3 years, yes, 3 years, Agent Martinez worked with a professional genealogist named Sarah Donovan to build family trees for each of the genetic matches. It was painstaking, tedious work. They traced birth certificates, marriage records, census data, obituaries, and military records. They built sprawling family trees that eventually connected back to common ancestors in the late 1800s. By early 2021, they'd narrowed the suspect pool down to 4 men who shared common ancestry with the genetic matches. Robert Kenneth Miller, 62, living in Springfield, Missouri James Edward Miller, 58, living in Kansas City. Missouri Thomas Ray Miller, 65, living in St. Louis. Missouri David Allen Franklin, 59, living in Branson, Missouri. All 4 men were the right age to have been 35 to 45 in 1995. All 4 had some connection to Wyoming in their past, work, family, travel. But which one was their attacker? In June 2021, the cold case team decided to approach the suspects carefully. They couldn't just show up and demand DNA samples. They had no evidence yet to justify warrants. Instead, they began surveillance and background investigations on all 4 men. 3 of them, Robert Miller, James Miller, and Thomas Miller, had no criminal records. They'd lived relatively stable lives with families and regular jobs. Their travel records showed no evidence they'd been in Wyoming in July 1995. But David Allen Franklin was different. David Franklin, 59 in 2021, had lived a transient life. He'd worked in construction oil fields and as a long-haul trucker. He'd been married twice, divorced twice. He'd moved frequently Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, Oklahoma, Wyoming, and back to Missouri over the years. Most concerning, he had a criminal record. In 1989, he'd been arrested in Arkansas for assaulting his girlfriend. Charges were eventually dropped when she refused to testify. In 1993, he'd been questioned but never charged in connection with a sexual assault in Oklahoma. The victim had described her attacker as a white male in his late 30s with dark hair and a beard. The description matched Franklin. And here was the most damning detail. Franklin's employment records showed he'd worked for a construction company in Rawlins, Wyoming from April 1995 through September 1995. He'd been living in Wyoming when Patricia Mitchell and Jake Thompson were attacked. On August 3, 2021, Special Agents Kruger and Martinez traveled to Branson, Missouri, where David Franklin was living in a small house on the outskirts of town. They knocked on his door at 7 a.m. Franklin answered, bleary-eyed, wearing a bathrobe. He was 59 years old now, overweight, his dark hair gone gray, but his build matched the victim's description from 1995. David Franklin? Agent Kruger asked. Yeah. Who wants to know? Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation. We'd like to talk to you about an incident that occurred in Carbon County in 1995. Franklin's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. What incident? An assault on 2 campers at South Spring Creek Reservoir in July 1995. Do you remember being in Wyoming that summer? 1995 was a long time ago. It's not the kind of thing most people forget. You were working construction in Rawlins that summer. We have your employment records. Franklin was silent for a long moment. Yeah, I was in Rawlins for a few months that year. So what? Did you ever go camping in the Medicine Bow National Forest while you were there? Maybe. I might have gone fishing a couple times. Fishing at South Spring Creek Reservoir. Could be. Like I said, it was a long time ago. The agents exchanged glances. Franklin wasn't denying being in the area. He was being careful, but not overly defensive yet. Mr. Franklin, 2 people were brutally attacked at that reservoir on July 23, 1995. They were camping. A man with a rifle assaulted them and left them to die. Do you know anything about that? I heard something about it back then. It was all over the news in Rawlins that summer. We'd like to take a DNA sample from you. Would you be willing to provide one voluntarily? And here, Franklin made the mistake that would ultimately seal his fate. If he'd refused, demanded a lawyer, the agents would have had to get a warrant, which would have taken time and legal wrangling. Instead, Franklin shrugged. Sure, I got nothing to hide. On August 10, 2021, the DNA results came back from the Wyoming Combined Laboratory. Dr. Chong called Agent Kruger personally to deliver the news. It's a match. David Allen Franklin is your suspect. The statistical probability of it being anyone else is 1 in 73 quadrillion. Kruger felt the rush of vindication, of finally getting justice for Sarah and Jake after 26 years. We've got him, he said quietly. They began preparing the case for the Carbon County Attorney's Office, compiling evidence, preparing charging documents. They were going to arrest David Franklin for kidnapping aggravated sexual assault, and attempted murder. And then, just 10 days later, everything fell apart. On August 20th, 2021, Special Agent Kruger received a phone call from the Branson, Missouri Police Department. "Are you looking for a David Allen Franklin, age 59? The officer asked. "Yes." "Why?" "He's dead. Heart attack. Died in his sleep last night. Paramedics pronounced him at the scene this morning." Kruger felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "Are you sure it's the same David Franklin? Address matches what you gave us. Want us to send you the death certificate?" "Yes." Immediately. The death certificate arrived by email an hour later. David Allen Franklin, age 59, had died of acute cardiac arrest at approximately 2 a.m. on August 20th, 2021. He'd been alone in his home. A neighbor had found him when she stopped by to return a borrowed lawnmower. He was dead. The man who'd attacked Sarah Mitchell and Jake Thompson, who'd terrorized them and nearly killed them, who'd stolen their peace and security and forever changed their lives, had died in his sleep before he could ever be arrested, charged, or face his victims in court. After 26 years, they'd finally identified him, and he'd escaped justice by 10 days. Under Wyoming state law, criminal charges cannot be filed against a deceased person. Without charges filed in district court, the suspect's name cannot be officially released to the public. This meant that David Franklin's identity would remain legally protected. The Carbon County Attorney's Office could not publicly name him as the suspect, even though they had definitive DNA proof. It was a bitter, frustrating legal technicality that added insult to injury. Sheriff Roybal was furious. "We have the evidence. We have the match. We know he did it. But we can't even give his name to the press? We can't let people know this case is solved." "That's the law," the county attorney explained helplessly. "Without charges filed, we can't identify a suspect. We can only say that DNA has identified the person responsible, and that person is deceased." On August 25th, 2021, Special Agent Kruger and Sheriff Roybal drove to Rawlins to personally tell Sarah and Jake the news. They met with Sarah first, at her home where she lived with her husband and 2 teenage kids. When they arrived, she knew immediately why they were there. "You found him," she said. "It wasn't a question." "We did," Kruger confirmed. DNA matched to a man who was living in Missouri. He worked construction in Rawlins in 1995. He has a history of violence against women. "We're certain he's the person who attacked you." Sarah's hands were shaking. "Where is he? When's the trial?" Kruger's expression fell. "He's dead, Sarah. He died of a heart attack before we could arrest him." The room was silent for a long moment. "Dead," Sarah repeated softly. "So he never has to answer for what he did." "No, he doesn't. I'm sorry." Sarah's husband, David Chun, put his arm around her. "Can you tell us his name?" "Legally, we cannot. Since no charges were filed, his identity is protected under Wyoming law." Sarah laughed bitterly. "Even in death, he gets privacy. But my name was all over the news in 1995. Everyone in this town knows what happened to me. And he gets to be anonymous." "It's not fair," Kruger said quietly. "None of this is fair. But I want you to know we got him. We identified him. He can't hurt anyone else. And everyone who matters, the investigators, the prosecutors, your family, we all know the truth." Jake Thompson's reaction was different. When they told him the news at his ranch, he just nodded slowly, his jaw clenched. "Dead," he said flatly. "He died in his sleep. Peaceful." "We don't know if it was peaceful," Agent Martinez offered. "More peaceful than what he deserved," Jake said, his voice hard. "More peaceful than what he put us through." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Medicine Bow Mountains in the distance. "For 26 years, I've wanted to look that bastard in the eye," Jake said quietly. "I've imagined it 1,000 times. What I'd say to him. What I'd do if I got 5 minutes alone with him. And now he's gone, and I'll never get that chance." "I know it's not the ending you wanted," Kruger said. "It's not an ending at all," Jake replied. "It's just nothing. He's gone, and I'm still here, still dealing with it every day. He escaped. That's all there is to it." On December 15th, 2021, Exactly 26 years after Sheriff McCoy's press conference announcing the case was stalled, Sheriff Archie Roybal held a press conference to announce the case had been solved. The conference room at the Carbon County Courthouse was packed with media, local residents, and law enforcement officials. Today, I'm here to announce that the 1995 assault case involving 2 young people at South Spring Creek Reservoir has been solved, Roybal began. Through the use of advanced DNA technology and forensic genealogy, the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigations Cold Case Team has identified the person responsible for this brutal attack. That person is deceased and will not face criminal charges. He continued, "Due to Wyoming state law, we cannot publicly identify the suspect since no charges were filed in district court before his death. However, I want to be absolutely clear. We have definitive DNA evidence. We know who did this. The case is solved." The room erupted with questions. "Can you tell us anything about the suspect?" He was a male, late 30s, at the time of the attack, who was living and working in Carbon County in 1995. He has since died of natural causes. "Are the victims satisfied with this resolution?" Roybal paused. "I think the victims are relieved to finally have answers. But satisfaction? No. How could anyone be satisfied when the person who hurt them never had to face justice? But they know the truth now. That's something. Why did the case go cold in 1995? The DNA technology available at that time simply wasn't advanced enough to identify a suspect without already having someone in the database. What we can do now with forensic genealogy didn't exist then. If it had, we might have caught him 25 years ago." The announcement made national news. The Medicine Bow attack, forgotten by everyone except those directly involved, was suddenly back in the headlines. Wyoming cold case solved after 26 years, suspect dead. DNA technology identifies attacker in 1995 wilderness assault, but he'll never face trial. Bittersweet justice. Victims get answers, but no day in court. True crime podcasts covered it. Online forums debated whether the authorities should have released the suspect's name anyway. Legality be damned. For Sarah and Jake, the media attention was exhausting. "We wanted closure," Sarah told a reporter from the Casper Star-Tribune. "We got answers. But I don't know if those are the same thing." Sarah Mitchell eventually found a form of peace with the resolution. "I spent 26 years thinking about that man," she said in an interview 18 months after the announcement. "Wondering who he was, where he was, if he was still hurting people. That not knowing was almost worse than what he did to me, because it never ended. The fear never ended. Now I know. He's gone. He can't hurt anyone else. He didn't get to stand trial, and that's infuriating. But he also didn't get to live his life without consequences." According to the investigators, he had a hard life, divorces, dead-end jobs, moving from place to place. Maybe karma got him before the courts could. I don't know. What I do know is that I survived. I have a beautiful family. I have a career helping kids. I have a life he tried to take from me, and I've lived it well. In a way, that's my justice. He's dead and forgotten, and I'm here surrounded by people who love me. Jake Thompson struggled more with the resolution. "People keep telling me I should be happy we got answers," he said bitterly in a rare interview. But answers aren't justice. He died in his sleep. No trial, no prison, no looking Sarah's family in the eye and hearing what he did to her. He just got away with it. I think about that night almost every day. I think about how if I'd been stronger, smarter, faster, maybe I could have stopped him, could have protected her. And then I think about how he lived for 26 years after that, free, while Sarah and I dealt with the aftermath. It makes me angry. It'll always make me angry. But over time, even Jake found a version of acceptance. "The ranch helps," he admitted. "Working with my hands, being outside, taking care of the land, it grounds me. And knowing his name, knowing he's dead, it does help in some way I can't quite explain. The not knowing was its own special torture. At least now I can stop wondering. I can stop looking at every stranger and thinking, is that him? It's over. Not the way I wanted, but over." The Medicine Bow case became a catalyst, for change in Wyoming and beyond. In 2022, a bill was introduced in the Wyoming State Legislature to modify the law regarding naming suspects in cold cases where the suspect dies before charges can be filed. The Sarah and Jake Law, as it became known, though that wasn't its official title, would allow law enforcement to publicly identify suspects in cold cases if DNA or other definitive evidence proves their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. A review board including prosecutors, judges, and victim advocates approves the disclosure of the victims, if alive, consent to the disclosure. The bill passed the Wyoming House but stalled in the Senate, where some legislators worried about the implications for deceased persons' reputations and their families. As of 2024, the law has not passed, but advocates continue to push for it. The success of the cold case team in solving the Medicine Bow attack, along with several other cases, led to increased funding for cold case investigations in Wyoming. In 2023, the Wyoming legislature appropriated an additional $500,000 annually specifically for cold case DNA testing and forensic genealogy services. The technology exists to solve these cases, said State Senator Maria Hernandez, who sponsored the funding bill. We owe it to victims and their families to use it. The Medicine Bow case proved what's possible when we invest in justice. The Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation now offers annual training for local law enforcement on evidence preservation and cold case investigation techniques. We learned from the Medicine Bow case that how you handle evidence in the first hours and days can determine whether a case is solvable decades later, said Special Agent Kruger, who now heads the cold case team. The investigators in 1995 did an excellent job preserving that DNA evidence. That's why we could solve it in 2021. We're training the next generation to do the same. In the years following the announcement, the U.S. Forest Service and Wyoming Game and Fish Department launched enhanced safety programs for backcountry users. Camping permit systems were established for remote areas. Trail cameras were installed in popular camping locations, controversial, but ultimately accepted. Cell phone signal boosters were installed at key points in the Medicine Bow National Forest. We can't prevent every crime, said Forest Supervisor Janet Yellowtail. But we can make it harder for predators to find isolated victims and easier for people to call for help. Where are they now? Sarah Mitchell continues to live in Rawlins with her husband David and their 2 children, now college-aged. She's been a special education teacher for 18 years and is beloved by her students and colleagues. She still doesn't camp, but she's made peace with the mountains. She hikes with friends during the day and has even returned to South Spring Creek Reservoir once, in 2023, with David and a group of 10 other hikers. It was hard, but healing. Jake Thompson still runs the family ranch outside Saratoga. He never married, but has close relationships with his brother's children, who spend summers on the ranch. He serves on the Carbon County Search and Rescue Team and has helped find dozens of lost hikers over the years. He says helping others is how he processes his own trauma. Special Agent David Kruger continues to lead the Wyoming cold case team. The Medicine Bow case was his first major success, and it cemented his commitment to the work. He's since helped solve 12 more cold cases in Wyoming. Sheriff Archie Roybal retired from the Carbon County Sheriff's Office in 2023. In his retirement speech, he cited the Medicine Bow case as one of the most important moments of his career. We gave 2 good people answers they'd waited 26 years for. That matters. David Allen Franklin's family, Franklin's ex-wife and adult children, were shocked to learn he was the suspect in the Medicine Bow attack. His second ex-wife told investigators that Franklin had been controlling and sometimes violent during their marriage, which ended in 2008. His children declined to comment publicly. Franklin is buried in an unmarked grave in a cemetery in Missouri. The Medicine Bow attack of 1995 stands as a testament to both the best and worst of human nature. The worst, a predator who stalked innocent victims in the wilderness, who inflicted unimaginable trauma, who lived free for 26 years while his victims suffered. The best, survivors who refused to be broken, investigators who never gave up, scientists who developed technology to speak for the voiceless, a community that never forgot. Sarah Mitchell and Jake Thompson went camping in July 1995, expecting a romantic weekend in the Wyoming wilderness they loved. They got a nightmare they'd carry forever. But they survived. And survival, especially when someone is trying very hard to kill you, is its own form of justice. The man who attacked them is dead and forgotten, his name protected by law, his crimes known only to a small circle. But Sarah and Jake are remembered differently. They're remembered as survivors, as fighters, as proof that even the worst trauma cannot destroy the human spirit if you refuse to let it. The Medicine Bow Mountains still stand where they always have, ancient and eternal. The South Spring Creek Reservoir still reflects the Wyoming sky. And somewhere in those mountains, in the shadows of the lodgepole pines, there's a small clearing where something terrible happened. But that clearing doesn't define the story. What defines the story is what happened next. Two people locked in a trunk, left to die, who fought their way out and walked 10 miles through wilderness to survive. Two people who rebuilt their lives piece by painful piece. Two people who, 26 years later, finally got to know the truth. Justice was delayed. Justice was incomplete. But the truth, after 26 years, finally came to light. The case is solved. The victim survived. And sometimes that has to be enough. Thanks for being here and listening to Sarah and Jake's story. This case shows us that even when justice feels impossible, even when decades pass and the guilty die before facing trial, truth still matters. Answers still matter. Survival still matters. Don't forget to hit subscribe and the bell for our latest stories. Drop a comment below about how you feel about cases where the suspect dies before trial. Stay safe, lock your doors, and always tell someone where you're going when you venture into the wilderness.